Not by a few villages, not by a kilometer or two, by hundreds of square kilometers and liberated in 72 hours, in what military analysts who track this war hour by hour are calling something they almost never call anything in this conflict, a turning point. And the reason it happened? It was planned in complete secrecy, hidden not just from Russia, hidden from most of Ukraine's own people. A months-long operation so precisely engineered that the moment it was launched, Russia never had a chance to stop it. Here's what nobody is explaining to you clearly. Here's the full story of what just happened on that front line and why it changes everything. If you want coverage like this, no spin, no filler, just the real story, hit subscribe right now. We break what others miss, because the scale of what just happened only makes sense when you see what was in the way. For nearly a year before this week, the Eastern Front looked like something out of the First World War, grinding, bloody, measured in meters, not miles. Russian forces had constructed what satellite analysts were describing as the most extensive European defensive system since the Second World War. 3 layers deep. The first layer, anti-tank ditches, concrete dragon's teeth, minefields so dense that demining teams estimated a full decade to clear them, and trench networks specifically engineered to funnel any attacking force into pre-aimed kill zones. The second layer, hardened firing positions, command posts buried meters underground, interlocking fields of fire. The third layer, the deep reserves, armor, artillery, electronic warfare units, elite forces held back specifically to crush any breakthrough before it could be exploited. Military analysts had one word for this architecture: layered. Breaking the first line didn't mean you'd broken through. It meant you were now fighting the second line, while the first-line survivors regrouped and the reserve force moved to cut you off. Ukraine had tried to break through something like this before. The 2023 summer counteroffensive, backed by NATO hardware, Western training, enormous international hope, hit the first defensive layer and stalled within weeks. The lessons from that failure were brutal, and they were studied. The answer Ukraine's military command arrived at after the 2023 failure wasn't more tanks. The tanks had proven incapable of crossing live minefields under sustained artillery fire without catastrophic losses. It wasn't more artillery. Russia's counter-battery radar was destroying Ukrainian guns faster than resupply could replace them. The answer was deception, not a feint, not a small diversionary move. A full-scale, multi-month strategic deception operation, complete with fake troop movements, fabricated logistics buildups, deliberate electronic emissions, and command post activity, all designed to convince Russian intelligence that the main Ukrainian offensive was coming in an entirely different direction. It worked. Russian armored reserves, the units specifically positioned to counterattack any Ukrainian breakthrough, were relocated to meet a threat that did not exist, away from where the real blow was about to land. And Ukraine knew exactly which sector that left exposed. Because Ukraine's intelligence picture of Russian positions, fed by satellite imagery, signals intelligence, drone surveillance, and human sources inside Russian-held territory built over 3 years, was more precise than Russia ever understood. We're just getting to the part where it gets truly shocking. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Ukraine has spent 3 years building something that military technology analysts describe as genuinely revolutionary, a battlefield intelligence system unlike anything assembled by a country its size. Tens of thousands of first-person view drones operating simultaneously across a 600-mile front, each one a sensor, each one feeding imagery, thermal data, and movement tracking into a processing system that builds and continuously updates a real-time picture of Russian positions. But the sensors are only half of it. Ukraine built, with significant Western assistance but Ukrainian engineering talent driving the architecture, an AI-assisted targeting system that correlates drone imagery, satellite passes, signals intelligence intercepts, and human intelligence reports into a continuously updated target database. Every Russian artillery piece, every command vehicle, every logistics depot, every fuel point, every repair facility, mapped, located with GPS coordinates. Updated as positions shifted. That database is what turned this offensive from a gamble into a plan. Because when you know where everything is, when you can hit what you aim at with confidence, The mathematics of offensive warfare change entirely. You don't have to destroy everything. You suppress the specific things that would stop your advance. You destroy the specific assets that would enable a counterattack. Precision changes the equation. And in the 96 hours before Ukrainian ground forces moved, that targeting system was used to execute the most precise pre-offensive preparation in this war's history. Ukraine struck Russian fuel depots, specifically surgically, in the offensive sector. Russian armored vehicles entered the operation at reduced fuel states that limited their mobility. Ukraine struck forward ammunition supply points. Russian artillery began experiencing shell shortages at precisely the moment Ukrainian infantry needed suppression windows to cross open ground. Ukraine struck hardened underground command posts with weapons selected specifically to penetrate their overhead protection. When those command posts went dark, when communications between frontline Russian units and their commanders started breaking, the coordination that makes a layered defense function began to collapse. Units that couldn't reach their command structure couldn't call in artillery support on the timelines the situation required. Artillery that couldn't communicate with forward observers fired on coordinates that were minutes old. In a fluid, fast-moving situation, minutes-old coordinates miss. 4 days of invisible surgical preparation. And then the ground forces moved. The initial penetration didn't happen where Russia was watching. It happened in the sector Russian intelligence had assessed as a secondary threat. A judgment shaped deliberately by the deception operation Ukraine had been running for months. The unit that led the breach wasn't the unit Russia expected. Ukraine's publicly visible order of battle had been deliberately manipulated. The actual strike force had been moved into position through a sequence of transfers and logistics operations specifically designed to look like routine rotation. It was the tip of the spear when Ukrainian armored vehicles crossed the first Russian defensive line using mine-clearing vehicles, engineer support, and precision suppression of the positions covering the breach point. What happened next is what Russian defensive doctrine failed to predict. Ukraine didn't stop to fight for the trench lines. Russian doctrine, built on 3 years of observing Ukrainian tactics, expected Ukrainian forces to slow once they hit the first defensive layer, to stop, to fight position by position, to give the reserve force time to identify the penetration point and begin moving to counterattack. Ukraine bypassed positions, left them for follow-on forces to clear, drove deep into the Russian defensive system before the reserve force, already displaced by the deception operation, no longer where it was supposed to be, could arrive. When the Russian counterattack force finally received its orders and began moving toward the breach, Ukrainian anti-armor teams, pre-positioned along the exact route those reserves would have to use, based on intelligence collected over 6 months, were already waiting. The counterattack ran into an ambush. Not all of it. Enough of it. The counterattack stalled. The breach widened. The exploitation began. In the first 24 hours after the initial breach, Ukrainian forces advanced between 15 and 22 kilometers on the main axis. In a war where 5 kilometers in a week has been reported as a significant advance, 15 to 22 kilometers in a single day is a different category of military event entirely. By hour 48, the liberated area exceeded 400 square kilometers. By hour 72, where we are now, Ukrainian forces had reached objectives that the most optimistic internal planning scenarios had projected as week 2 or week 3 targets. Russian losses in the sector, based on Ukrainian military reporting and cross-referenced with open-source drone footage, between 60 and 90 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles confirmed destroyed or abandoned. Prisoners of war in the hundreds. Soldiers cut off by the speed of the advance who surrendered rather than attempt to fight their way out of encirclement. 3 Russian battalion tactical groups assessed as combat ineffective, not destroyed but unable to function as organized military units because their command structures, logistics, and cohesion have been disrupted beyond short-term self-repair. Those numbers represent more than territorial change. They represent structural damage to Russian combat power in this sector that will take weeks, possibly months, to reconstitute. And Ukraine's general staff is not giving Russia those weeks. Russia's entire domestic narrative about this war, the story Vladimir Putin tells his population, the proposition that sustains public support through mobilization, through economic pain, through the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, rests on a single foundational claim. Russia is winning, slowly, at cost, but winning. Time is on Russia's side. When the map moves the wrong way, when hundreds of square kilometers change hands in 72 hours and multiple Russian units collapse in the process, that narrative fractures. Not completely, not immediately. Russian state media's institutional capacity for suppressing bad news is genuine and deeply embedded, but it fractures. Russian military bloggers, the mill bloggers whose audiences include the families of soldiers, Russian nationalist communities, the segment of Russian society most invested in the outcome of this war, are already posting. Not with the triumphalist tone of state media, with the specific technical language of people who understand military operations and can read open source data. They are angry. They are naming failures. They are asking questions that don't have comfortable answers. That anger, spreading through audiences whose sons and husbands and fathers are on those front lines, creates political pressure that eventually arrives in Moscow. Putin has managed that pressure before. He is skilled at it. But each time the map moves the wrong direction, the pressure grows, and the tools for managing it become more expensive. Ukraine's general staff is not planning to stop. The exploitation phase of an offensive, when the enemy is disorganized, reserves are destroyed or still in transit, and psychological shock is compressing decision-making at every level of Russian command, is the most valuable period in offensive warfare. And that window closes. It always closes. Ukraine knows this. The orders going to exploiting units right now prioritize depth. Keep moving on the main axis. Don't stop to clear every position. Create maximum penetration depth while the window remains open. Simultaneously, forces on the flanks of the breakthrough are securing the shoulders, the sides of the penetration, against the Russian counterattacks that will eventually materialize. A breakthrough unsecured on its flanks creates a salient exposed to attack from three directions. Military history is full of offensives that broke through and then got encircled and destroyed because the flanks weren't held. Ukraine's planners have read that history. The engineers and anti-armor units go to the flanks. The armored and mechanized forces go forward. And the drones, persistent, everywhere, giving Ukraine a real-time picture of every Russian movement, are watching all of it simultaneously. Because in the urgency of maps and military analysis and geopolitical consequence, it becomes easy to lose sight of what is actually happening on that ground. Ukrainian soldiers are dying in this offensive, not abstractly, specifically. Young men and women who drove forward into positions defended by soldiers whose job it is to kill them, who crossed minefields in vehicles designed to clear them, but not always able to survive the blast, who took fire from artillery that still had ammunition, who fought in the close, brutal intimacy of clearing trench lines where the enemy is meters away and decisions are made in seconds. The liberation of that territory means Ukrainian families returning to villages they were forced to leave. It means graves that were unmarked under occupation can finally be visited by the people who loved the ones in them. It means children who have spent months, some of them years, in basements to survive Russian strikes can come back to streets they only knew from photographs. It also means Ukrainian soldiers who didn't come back, whose families are being notified right now, whose names will eventually appear on memorials in towns across Ukraine. On the Russian side, soldiers who were serving in those positions, some mobilized against their will from Russian cities and towns, who found themselves in the wrong place when the line broke. Prisoners, casualties, men still somewhere in the confusion of a collapsed front, trying to figure out which direction is safe. Their families watching state television report a tactical regroupment, waiting for phone calls that aren't coming. War is always this. No matter how decisive the military outcome, no matter how clean the map looks, it is always this. In Washington, the political debate over Ukraine aid, painful, contested, shaped by voices arguing the war is unwinnable and continued support is money with no achievable end state, just got harder to sustain. It is difficult to argue Ukraine cannot win when Ukraine just won. Visibly, significantly, with weapons and intelligence support that American taxpayers funded. The return on investment argument just received a data point that supporters of continued aid will use in every congressional hearing for the next 6 months. In Beijing, Chinese military analysts are conducting the same study of this operation they have conducted of every significant development in this war. What worked? What failed? What does it reveal about the capability gap between a well-supported, intelligently led military adapting in real combat against a larger adversary? China has been watching this war as a laboratory. Every lesson about drones, about precision strike, about logistics resilience, about the information dimension of modern warfare goes directly into Chinese military planning, not for Ukraine, for Taiwan. In Tehran, Iran has supplied Russia with drones and ballistic missiles throughout this war. If this offensive represents a genuine shift in momentum, if Russia begins to lose the trajectory argument that has sustained its strategy, the strategic value of being Russia's primary weapons supplier starts to look considerably less stable. 3 days ago, that map looked one way. Today, it looks completely different. Hundreds of square kilometers liberated, Russian units broken. The most significant Ukrainian territorial advance since the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022, which itself seemed unbelievable when it was happening. But here is what you need to understand about this moment. The unbelievable thing is not that it happened. The unbelievable thing is that it was built over months in secret, through a deception operation that moved Russian reserves away from the real strike axis, through an intelligence campaign that mapped every Russian asset in the target sector with precision that previous wars couldn't have achieved, through a pre-offensive strike campaign that degraded Russian logistics and command at exactly the right moment, through weapons that Western partners supplied not just because Ukraine asked, but because Ukraine made the case that it knew how to use them. This didn't happen because Ukraine got lucky. This happened because Ukraine learned from 2022, from the failure of 2023, from every painful lesson written in Ukrainian blood on fields that are now being liberated. The war is not over. Let's be clear about that. Russia has strategic depth that Ukraine does not, population that Ukraine does not, nuclear weapons that Ukraine does not. The ability to absorb this defeat, reconstitute its forces, and continue, and it will. But today, in this moment, the map looks different than it did 72 hours ago. And for the grandmothers unlocking doors they hadn't touched in months, for the children running into yards they'd only seen in photographs, for the families coming home to streets they were forced to leave, the map being different is everything. Watch the flanks. Watch Russia's reserve movements. Watch what happens in the next 72 hours when Ukraine's momentum meets reconstituted Russian resistance, because that collision is coming. And when it does, we'll be here to break it down. If this kind of deep, clear, honest analysis is what you want, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think this goes in the next 30 days? We read every single one.